Hello and welcome to Grinding Meeting number 44, The Nature of Sin. I should be clear. What I'm trying to describe doesn't actually have a name, but it has more than anything else, it overlaps with the concept of sin. So I'm going to be using the word sin because I don't have another word. Got 18 titles here. Keep me on track. This is a problem of novel concepts and analogies. We all think that we can be exposed to something new, and words can convey something entirely new to you, and you can just incorporate it. But really, it doesn't work that way. If you come across something that's actually novel, something that you don't have a place in the framework of your understanding of things to put it into, typically by displacing something else. Oh boy, why is my stream? Okay. I got a little bump on the stream. So sometimes in order to get it, and my goal here is just to take this concept out of my head and present it in a format that I can get into other people's heads. I'm not saying this is the absolute truth. I'm not saying everyone should believe this. What I think is that this is I hope to provide a useful lens for understanding human behavior. I guess you could say it's a argument from self-evidence. I think that, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to have to come at it. Sometimes if there aren't words for a thing, you can present people with a series of analogies, and by kind of synthesizing the common elements of those analogies, you can gain an understanding of a thing that there weren't really words to capture. And I'm going to try to present a novel concept through analogies. Metaphysical and naturalistic lenses. I should be clear. What I am presenting is validating for essentially Christianity, but it's not limited to that. In the same way that the discovery of trigonosis validated the Bible's prohibition on eating pig. They didn't understand why it was such a bad idea. It wasn't something that they could get their heads around. But what they could get their heads around is that God didn't want you to do it, so don't do it. Not that, hey, there's this complicated disease that you can get if you don't cook your meat well enough. And it's probably safer to just not eat it, since people are going to screw up fairly regularly. Just don't do it. It's easier to say, hey, God says it's dirty, don't eat it. I'm not comparing this to the discovery of trigonosis. I'm just using that as an analogy. There are, when it comes to like meaning, like meaning of life stuff, there isn't one correct lens. You kind of need several. It's kind of like when you're trying to image microbiological stuff, there isn't like an objective best way to look at the things. They will use lots of different stains. They will use different lenses, different magnifications, several different lighting strategies, different ways of capturing the information, of compiling it. So the best image is the one that serves you best in that moment, but you are always better having multiple ways of viewing a thing that doesn't really have a literally one best way of viewing it. And when it comes to like, meaning stuff, the objective reality lens isn't really the most appropriate lens. Or the objective truth lens, or scientific truth. the metaphorical and pragmatic, it's more their domain when you're, trying to figure out the meaning of life stuff. Again, I got ahead of myself a little bit. Literal, metaphorical, and pragmatic truth. I did kind of cover this already, but I should distinguish them. Like literal, you could call that scientific truth, objective truth, the things that you can demonstrate through the scientific process. Metaphorical truth would be a fictional story, but the interactions of the characters and how they behave transmit truths about the experience of being human and can teach you things about human nature, teach you things about yourself. Even if nothing in the story ever actually happened, there can be truths contained within a completely fictional story. And the pragmatic truth would be, don't eat pig. Unless you really know how to cook it well, which we've gotten better at, but that was not always the case. There's a great example. A pragmatic truth is something that isn't literally true, but if you live your life as if it is true, you will, on average, have better results than someone who doesn't accept it as true. The classic example is all guns are loaded. Obviously, this is not literally true. It could not be literally true. At some point, when it's manufactured, it will be unloaded. And it is entirely possible to have have one that isn't loaded. But if you are a person that handles them regularly, and if you know anybody who does, they basically live by this, that you treat them all as if they are loaded. Because compared to people who don't live as if all guns are loaded and don't check every single firearm when they take possession of it, things go better for the people who believe it, or live by it at least, than people who don't. And I guess I kind of got into the limits of pre-existing language. I kind of described this earlier, where there are some things that you can't really get to with the current words, and for a series of analogies and metaphors, you can help someone build a model in their head of the thing you're trying to communicate. But you need to start somewhere, and sin is the best fit. There's a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram of what it is I'm trying to describe in sin. Most of where it doesn't overlap is moral prescriptions on society. I'm really describing a mechanism. You could call it a social, psychological mechanism that is basically at the center of all unhealthy interactions between people who I'll get to that. So, rather than bury the lead any further, one way of describing, and I've described it this way before, the thing I'm trying to describe is the accumulation of negative self-judgment. Sin. To explain why I make a connection between these things, I'm going to borrow Jonathan Haidt's Elephant and Rider model and add the stenographer. So briefly, the Elephant and Rider analogy is that it's best to see yourself as an elephant and a rider, whereas your elephant is your unconscious, more primal, more emotional side, and the rider is the self-aware, intellectual, narrative-generating side. almost all of your decision making is done by the elephant, but the rider has the experience of making all of those choices. In some people, it's very much like a rock star and their publicist or agent. The rock star runs around and does a bunch of crazy stuff, and then the agent or publicist has to go and try to smooth everything over and craft a narrative where the person's not being, basically a piece of crap. And we do that for ourselves all the time. So the elephant and rider is used a lot, and it's very, very useful. I believe it's not like a decision-making part of your brain consciousness. I believe that there is an objective record kept of everything you do and don't do, and you have no control over this. It is basically a court stenographer just recording everything that happens. I'm going to borrow a strange analogy. The analogy of the sportscaster. Now imagine your typical sportscaster, not as much now. I think they're a little bit more objective now, but there were times where a lot of when the home team was playing, they watched them with rose-colored glasses. Every foul that gets called against their team is just a travesty, unless it's like super overt. And then basically just having a massive bias for the home team. That is our rider. Our rider has a massive bias to not just put us at the center of what's going on, but to always see ourselves in the best possible way and to craft narratives about events that make us look good, even if it doesn't match the stenographer's record. Now, where the, I guess you say, stenographer's record comes into play is that imagine you took that sportscaster and you already have a game that he was announcing, and he's being his regular super biased self, and you have that recording. Now imagine you Charles Xavier, Professor X him, or use the Infinity Gauntlet or whatever, and you show him the same game again, except he is completely unable to recognize which team is the one he has a bias for. In fact, he experiences it as if he doesn't know any of the players, doesn't know where they're at, doesn't know what the teams are, and he is calling the game essentially without bias. And you record that. The gap between those two recordings, I thought this would go smoother. Essentially, that you will. Okay, and then you split them into a third person. This wasn't how I planned on doing it, but this will work, I guess. And then you again remove all the context, and then have that third person judge how biased the first person is by comparing, his normal self with his, Professor X self, who's now unbiased, and the gap between those two, it's not quite sin, but it's the gap between, and I've said this, how do I keep seeing stutters on my stream? I'm not having any overload warnings. Doesn't matter. Another way to look at sin, it's the gap between what you actually did and what you should have done, independent of the story the writer is telling himself. Okay, I have my stream, up here, because I'm getting showing no drop frames. Okay, I think I'm okay. I don't know why it keeps doing that. It must be a problem on YouTube's end. Okay, I just rewatched the part where it said it was stuttering, and it seems to be just fine. So I'm going to be ignoring that from here on out. So yes, it's you are capable of making a deeper part of yourself is capable of making an objective, moral judgment about your actions, and this is independent of the story you tell yourself. And the gap between what you know would have been the optimally moral thing to do and what you actually did could be seen as sin, or then you will accumulate negative self-judgment as everyone falls short of their, nobody can perform optimally all the time. This is something that you accumulate over time. And you could call this the moral performance gap. Which I've already described twice, so I can skip it again, but metabolizing sin. Now this negative self-judgment, cumulative negative self-judgment, it can only be paid for, it can only be metabolized through suffering of some kind or another by you or by someone else or something else. And this is, this touches sort of on the wages of sin is death. But death comes in many, many doses. I really wish I understood why the stream keeps flickering at me like that. I'm not seeing any problems down below. Okay, gotta let it go. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. Quoting Team 4-Star. And once you accumulate enough of this cumulative negative self-judgment, the healthier people will self-sabotage. The slightly less healthy people will self-sabotage with collateral damage. There are some people that when they're not feeling well, when they're sick or when they're in pain or maybe they just woke up and they're grumpy in the morning, they will go out of their way to avoid interacting with other people because they don't want to risk, they don't want to share their suffering. Some people say misery loves company. But for the highest quality people, if they know that they're miserable or in some way or another, they don't want to have any collateral damage and they typically want to be alone. Other people, the collateral damage type, it's not like toxic, but it's a little more selfish. And like I said, it's the misery loves company. The third way of metabolizing sin is to put it on something else and sacrifice that. Or, in another way of putting it, you conscript someone to suffer for your sin. Now, in ancient Judaism, the standard move was to have a ritual where you owned your shortcomings, cast them onto a goat or a lamb, and, everybody would do this, and then you would sacrifice it in a ritual to Yahweh, to God. And it paid for your sins. But it wasn't just it. It was sacrificing something valuable is a punishment. And that's why it was, you don't sacrifice, like, it's like the Catholic thing. It's like, if you give up something for Lent that you didn't really give a crap about, it's kind of pointless. The point is to give up something that was valuable to me. And at the time, livestock was valuable, and to just destroy the value is a form of suffering, because it took suffering to create that value. And when you just destroy it, it really comes back to a person. So it isn't just, a blood ritual. I'm not going to say brilliance, because it's not like somebody just generated it, but I should say that I believe religions evolved based on their environmental pressures, and one of them basically kicked the butts of the rest of them overall, and that was Christianity. And I believe a big part of that was, if you actually, if you believe Jesus was not just a real person, but he was divine, that he was a son of God, and that he allowed himself to be sacrificed for the sins that all humans would create throughout time. So that even today, if you do something wasn't right, he can be the lamb. Now, you will feel bad. Just owning it is important, and feeling bad that, someone has to suffer for what you did, is a way for people to own their crap and to metabolize their sin. And I think that's a big part of why Christianity, essentially the most successful religion on that has existed on planet Earth. Not a Christian. I suppose you could call me a fan? Okay. Now, if you want to metabolize your sin, and you don't have a religious outlet, and you don't want to make yourself suffer, you can use vampiricism. The analogy, there's a reason, vampire stories just make sense, and the different people telling them, they're not just copying off each other. They are drawing from an unconscious shared experience of this part of this phenomena that I'm talking about and trying to use words to explain. Freaking YouTube. It's like, stream is excellent. Bitrate too high. Stream is excellent. Bitrate too high. Stream is excellent. Bitrate too high. It keeps going back and forth. Like, well, at any rate, it's basically, a vampire is a creature that has become corrupted, that is impure to the extreme. Whatever might be on the opposite end of the spectrum from pure, that is what they are. Corrupted, selfish, a parasite that can only live at the expense of others, and a person who will not change their behavior to generate less sin, cumulative negative self-judgment, and they get by casting their sin onto other people and making them suffer, is essentially a vampire. And it is very interesting in the analogies contained in the stories of vampires. In a lot of conflicts, in a lot of basically Twitter, online gaming, where you're playing on teams against other teams, there is a toxicity that has basically, people used to be much more overtly toxic. They'd be in text or voice, but as the owners of the games crack down, it doesn't go anywhere. It just transforms into a more subtle context. And it basically manifests as people secretly to others, often secretly to themselves, will deliberately, but usually unconsciously, sabotage the success of the people they are supposed to be on a team with. And I've seen this in Rocket League for a long time, and I just eventually mapped out all the common ways people will sabotage, and they pretty much all do it in the same ways. But part of the process is they will, and this is true in road rage, or even the crazy person on the bus that you know better than to make eye contact with. There are people that are basically starving vampires, and they're going around trying to poke people. So when the people push back, they can tell themselves that this other person is the toxic one. This is a bad person, and I can cast my sin onto this bad person and make them suffer. And the corruption of the other person is critical in the process of vampiricism, social vampiricism, I guess you could call it. And this is where in the vampire lore, the vampire can't come into your house unless you invite him. In the same way, if there's an asshole going down the road and just being a jerk to people, he is trying to invite people into a conflict. And that's why a lot of times if somebody cuts you off, it's just best to let them go and find their fight with somebody else. Because if you respond, it's go time, and you have accepted the invitation. You have invited the vampire into your house. And if you respond in kind, you have essentially allowed yourself to be corrupted. Also in slasher flicks in like the 80s and even in the 90s, it wasn't a coincidence that, if there was a lot of those films had a little sexy time going on there between a couple of the characters, especially Friday the 13th. And they were like always the first ones to be killed. And probably not coincidental. Corrupting yourself makes you vulnerable. And this has appeared in a few ways. And once you become infected, you will try to revisit this process on others. You are basically turned. It is also interesting that in these vampire stories, that the pure cannot just be taken. They have to be corrupted first. And the symbol of the cross will cause vampires to recoil in horror because you are too pure for their purposes, you could say. And it's funny, it's become a summer tradition. I work in a labor-intensive, pretty hot environment. It gets really miserable in the summer. And a couple of years ago, well, the first year I did the abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago, and last year I did the full version, and I think I have about 30 hours out of like 70 some hours left for my third run through this summer. And one thing that is very, very interesting is when they would bring people in and they would know these people didn't do anything wrong. And they would terrify them, and you had good reason to be terrified because everyone knew a number of people that just disappeared one day. Government, MKVD showed up at their house, grabbed them, never saw them again. So you have good reason to be terrified if you are in an interrogation room. So they would first try to get you to confess to things. And if you confessed, well, you are corrupted, you have admitted you're corrupted, and then things can proceed. Now, if you won't confess to anything, what they will do is, I don't know if it's Christian, but Catholic theology, the deepest level of hell is reserved for betrayers. And that is no matter what else happened, the main thing interrogators tried to do after the Russian Revolution, I did this for decades, is to try to get you to sell out somebody you knew, to betray them. And people were scared and weak and were often talked into this. And pretty much every time they could get them to do this, and then they were off to the gulag. Now, to be fair, they were probably off to the gulag anyway, but this seemed to be a critical part of the process of interrogation, is to get people to betray other people. There were a few situations in the book that were very, very interesting, because there were individuals that would not confess to anything. They did not believe they'd done anything wrong, and refused to sell anybody else out. And they're like, you can kill me if you want, you can lock me up forever, but I'm not betraying anybody, and I'm not confessing to anything. And the interrogators and like the people who were used to the interrogators that were used to people just rolling over on people were not just baffled by this, they were abhorred by it. They literally got scared of these people, especially religious women. They could set their jaw and say, I don't care what you do to me, and I am not cooperating. Do what you will with me. You can't corrupt me. And the interrogators were literally scared of these people, like terrified, recoiling in horror, not unlike a vampire from a cross. Now, once you've been turned, you could say, you run into a problem of, yes, you can find people who you can label as the bad, which is, basically Twitter, is people who, I guess I'll come back to that. You essentially, when you tap into this process to cast your sin to others, either people who are corrupted or you corrupt them yourself, or some combination, usually a combination. The act of putting your sin onto another person and then making them suffer for your sin, that process generates more sin. You've lowered your cumulative negative self-judgment by doing this, but the process itself generates more sin. So it is almost like a drug resistance pattern, to where you need to keep taking it up a notch in an attempt to normalize. But that only works for so long, and that's why a lot of people, especially the political extreme types, tend to keep ratcheting it up until they are saying very, very, very crazy things, because you look at them as a desperate, starving vampire. It makes a little more sense. The other problem in online gaming and online communication: barriers and abstracted interactions. I did a stream on the psychology of road rage, and I opened it with the video, and there are many of these you can find on YouTube. Just fence fighting dogs will probably get you there. And in many of these videos, you will see two dogs on either side of a fence, just absolutely vicious, super aggressive. You would swear if that gate wasn't there, that they would just be tearing each other apart. And then somebody hits a button and the gate starts sliding out of the way. And as the barrier between them disappears, they all just chill out and act like it's no big deal, like whatever. And then when he hits the button again and the gate starts closing, you can see them start getting hit. And then they're right back to where they were. And you can do it over and over again to where as soon as the gate's open, they're all like chill, whatever. But as soon as that gate's closed and there's a barrier between them, the aggression just goes through the roof. We are not that different. And just having some glass and steel between us and other people is enough to manifest this. Much like the dogs, a lot of road rage are behaviors that would not have manifested in a face-to-face interaction. I am often reminded of a funny public service radio announcement about road rage, where basically they took the premise of road rage and act like people were doing it with their shopping carts at a grocery store. And it was actually really funny because it just kind of illuminated how people would never do this if they had to look each other in the face. And there wasn't a barrier between them. And having abstracted interactions functions as a barrier. The internet was a very cool place when it first came out because people were treating each other as they would people in the other world. But as the barrier to entry of the internet, basically they added the wheelchair ramps for the technologically impaired. Enough people realized that, oh wait, I don't have to be nice because there's no repercussions. I can be the kind of asshole that I always wanted to be without having to pay the price for being the asshole I always wanted to be. And I'd say behavior equals nature minus social constraints. Now, if you are a low status person and you can't get away with being a dick to many people, you will typically not be a dick to many people because that will just get you ostracized. So, but if your status rises, either, in a number of ways, but typically you become rich or powerful, you'll watch the person turn into a piece of crap. Not every time, but, the people that already were, because now there's no longer the social restraint on their behavior because they can maintain their status even acting that way. And it is my opinion that that power corrupts is inaccurate. Power doesn't corrupt. It reveals. And in a sense, online interactions are interactions where you can act out something closer to your actual nature without repercussions. And as soon as people started figuring this out, things got dark on the internet, very much more toxic. And what you have in online gaming, like Rocket League, Call of Duty, and many, many other games, whether it's road rage, whether it's two guys at the bar who regularly get into fights with people, but they say it's just people being assholes, but they keep drinking and going to the bar and running into people they get into fights with, whether it's people going on Twitter and trying to find the bad people and set them straight. And it's it's aggressive and competitive projection, which is it's the opening maneuver to vampiricism, where you make someone else suffer for what you did. This is my conception of a thing that is closely related to sin. I hope I've put something like the concept I have into your mind. I am the Expert Layman. You all have a great day.